Okay, well, we've got to figure out the history of philosophy, essentially. So that's what we're going to talk about now, a certain sort of chronology. We are breaking down the course into 4 historical periods. That's supposed to be an N. The ancient, the medieval, the modern, and the contemporary. All right. Now, in terms of philosophy, for giving dates that are very approximate, these are just basically for our own convenience. So the first philosophers, that we could call them as such, appeared in Greece around 650 BC. And the ancient period ended, for us, we'll say, around 500 AD. And what ended the ancient period was the fall and destruction of the Roman Empire. So when Rome fell, that kind of ended the ancient period. The medieval, so we say 500, but the medieval I'm going to put 800 AD. And the reason why is because for about 300 years after the fall of Rome, the West was plunged into what's called the Dark Ages, anarchy, chaos. It was a time in which there was no economic or political stability. But in 800, a guy by the name of Charlemagne, you may have heard of him. If not, you might want to look him up. So Charlemagne is able to put together a bit of an empire and create some kind of stability. Okay, so the medieval empire will say from 800 AD to about 1400. Now, we could say, you know what, let me do this actually. This is not a history class, but nevertheless, we should be a little bit more precise. We're going to say 1500. However, there was also what's called the Renaissance that happened. And the Renaissance happened about 1350 to, 1550 or so. And the Renaissance is a time that is quite different from the medieval, but we'll see that in a little while. And then the modern period pretty much began, we can say from, we'll say 1500 or so to World War II. That's called modern. The contemporary world is World War II to present. Okay, now, where can I change my colors? Nope. Somewhere I can change my colors. Nope. Come on. Nope. Okay. I guess I can't change my colors. Here we go. Ah. Let's use this yellow. Okay. So the ancient period is a time in which philosophy is discovered. So this was the first philosophy ever. And really, we can also use the word science. In philosophy, the philosophers didn't really see a difference in what we would call science and they would call philosophy. And the thing about philosophy is that it is not mythology. So you'll notice here we had 650 as our date. Well, in the past, people understood things by myth, right? So especially the Greeks, think of the Greek gods, Poseidon and, all that kind of stuff, Zeus. And so they understood things by their gods and by supernatural accounts and that sort of thing. However, around 650, a bunch of guys called the Pre-Socratics, well, they didn't call themselves the Pre-Socratics, later historians did, began instead to understand things as we would today call scientifically. That is, they used human reason and human observation to understand things instead of mythology. And that's kind of what characterizes ancient philosophy. And many of our sciences and many of our Western intellectual foundations began in this period. So the medieval, so when Rome fell apart, right, you had a world in which the only institution left was the Christian church, specifically the Catholic. Really quickly, historically, what happened is Rome, which initially was a pagan culture, became Christian in the 300s AD, and the Emperor Constantine created a universal Christian church. And the word Catholic simply means universal in Latin. In around 476, when Rome fell apart, Rome had occupied all of Europe. But when it fell apart, all the government and all the army and all of the infrastructure left, except for the church. So Europe became very dominated by the Catholic Church because there's nothing left. And so philosophy at the time is heavily influenced by the church. Even science is influenced by the church. Now, a lot of people have this idea that, oh, the church kept everybody ignorant and all that kind of stuff. That's not true. The church actually codified and preserved knowledge, and towards the 12th and 13th centuries, the church also gave rise through the monasteries to science. It wasn't until much later in this period, specifically in the 14 and 1500s, when the Inquisition began to cramp down on that sort of thing, but it was for political reasons, not necessarily science. However, what began to happen is this. The Renaissance, a couple things happened. The Renaissance brought in a whole bunch of new works from the ancient period, which had been lost to the medievals in the West. And then you had a couple of things that happened. One was the Black Death. Surely you've heard of that. Disease that killed off like a third or two-thirds of the European population. And the second was the year of 3 popes. So here's the deal. In the medieval period, people tended to believe in Catholic theology. The Pope had incredible power in the secular as well as the intellectual and spiritual world. And it was believed that there was one Pope and one church. However, in 1337, 3 popes began to oppose one another to try to become the Pope. And then you had the Black Death that killed people off. The point is, people began to no longer accept the supremacy of the Catholic Church. And then in 1517, of course, you know that one, since this is Concordia, what happened in 1517 was Martin Luther and the first Protestant revolution against the Catholic Church. That changed everything. So here comes the modern period. The modern period kind of begins around this time. You could say that the discovery of America in 1492 and Martin Luther in the 1500s led to the modern period, which was really a revolution in science. That is, instead of theology and the Catholic Church, instead science became the sort of foundational kind of knowledge. And so there you had all kinds of revolutions. You had revolutions politically, religiously, and in terms of epistemology. In other words, what we call true. And this was also the birth of the nation state. And so here we see the scientific revolution and all these things happening. And then lastly, we have the present, the contemporary world. Why World War II? World War II was a time that really changed the way people thought. Because it was believed, for instance, that with reason and science, man could solve his problems. The modern period was a very sort of positive period in which the belief was that science could make our lives better. By the time people lived through World War I and World War II, this science produced things like atom bombs, machine guns, mustard gas. So it turns out maybe science is not such a great thing. And so there's a great sort of uncertainty in the contemporary world, or what we could call skepticism. And that's why, for instance, politically today people talk about, as I'm writing this little thing right now, people talk about the need for 3 bathrooms, the transgender bathroom. And that's exactly what we're talking about uncertainty, where even, gender is no longer certain. You can't just say something is what it is. And so the contemporary world is a world in which things are not black and white at all. But anyways, these are the approximate sort of, periods that we're going to be talking about in the course, and we'll be looking at each of these in turn and getting a sense of the philosophy of each of these periods.